If you, like me, have been ogling over an HDMI 2.1 OLED, or specifically LG's 2022 C series, well, I think I've learned that being an early adopter of the year's latest models is not a great experience. The C2 OLED's launch firmware has been profoundly frustrating to me, both as someone with current gen consoles and most especially as a retro enthusiast. There are a lot of concerns for gaming here, from missing or scaled back features that existed on 2020 and 2021 models, worse compatibility with oddball resolutions, and bizarre input lag issues, with no guarantees that firmware updates will ever bring the C2 in line with the C1 or CX. So, let's get into it. Honestly, I was content enough to stick with my 2017 LG OLED, the C7, for at least several more years in spite of missing out on new console features like 4K at 120Hz and variable refresh rates. But in the summer of 2021, I noticed a flaw had begun to rear its head: visible degradation in the form of vertical streaks across the screen. It's easier to see it with my own eyes than it is to capture it in pictures and video, but it's most visible in flatter shades of red, yellow, pink, or orange. Scrolling or panning motion in a game makes my eyes notice it quite easily, and while it's generally not particularly visible in highly detailed scenes, almost any game could show it from time to time, whether that's from running across a sandy beach or via a stylized reddish skybox. Anecdotal evidence does suggest that a lot of 2017 OLEDs are showing their age compared to newer models with various design optimizations, which have even further warded off image retention, burn-in, and premature degradation. So far at least. And people seem to be optimistic that these will continue to produce a clean picture for longer than a C7. The 2020 CX and GX and the 2021 C1 and G1 models proved to be extremely popular and are considered some of the few TVs from their respective years to have comprehensively offered the full package of settings that gamers would want for both modern and retro. So even though I felt a bit burned by LG and perhaps by OLED technology in general, I thought that sticking with the videophile gamer's champion and a mature technology like LG's OLED panels as opposed to, say, Samsung's super new QD OLED panels was the smart move. Either way, I thought it would be fun to try my hand at a gaming-centric review of a brand spanking new HDMI 2.1 TV, since I'd be able to test for compatibility and performance with the type of gaming hardware that matters to me and our audience. I mean, everything about the CX and C1 sounds so good, so why would anything change? A C2 review will be easy, it'll be fun. Right. Fun. So for video production purposes, I've temporarily placed my old C7 directly to the left of the C2. Remember, older TV on the left, newer TV on the right. If those model numbers sound backwards, 7 and 2 are the last digits of the year of release. So yeah, they're going to have to come up with a new numbering system pretty soon. Rather than a basic game mode, now the picture mode for gaming is called Game Optimizer, and it comes complete with its own separate stylized interface that you can enable, which includes several useful tools that you can't access, or at least not access as easily with the standard menu system. It's very different from what I'm used to, but it's quite similar to the previous year's interface. Now, if you're new to these TVs, you'll need to know that you will need to double check these and other picture settings every time you connect a new device or send a different resolution or HDR format that you haven't used on that input before. You can tell it to copy settings to other inputs, but it's limitedly useful since more often than not, I've found it to be necessary to double check that the game optimizer is on, that sharpness is 0, and so forth every time a new signal is introduced. Unless you're making a direct connection with a normal modern console, it's usually not going to be in game optimizer mode by default. Great, so now that we've eliminated sources of artifacting, let's see what kind of difference in picture quality we have. Let's start with the good. HDR content is clearly better on the C2, although with the more accurate HGIG setting, I wouldn't call it a life-changing leap over the C7 or anything. As always, HDR highlights are going to be blown out and clipped in the YouTube video, but this should give you a good idea as to how the peak brightness compares on a 2017 model versus 2022. In fact, the C2's HDR might almost be too bright for me, and honestly, I think I prefer the peak brightness set to medium rather than the default of high. I'm not too interested in nit measurements or anything like that, but the HDR picture has superb contrast. It is just a pleasure to look at. There's also an HDR feature called dynamic tone mapping that helps with stuff like if the PS5 is set to always on HDR. And I believe this applies to most models released after the C7, because on that one, the always on HDR looks terrible because the PS5 menu and games not designed for HDR look very dark. So dynamic tone mapping makes the PS5 menu look absolutely awesome on the C2. And even though it's not exactly accurate to display SDR games in this way, they look very striking within this HDR container in this mode. Basically, dynamic tone mapping is great at making stuff that wasn't designed for HDR or content with a poor HDR implementation actually look quite good when contained within an HDR signal. The dynamic part of dynamic tone mapping gives me pause, although so far I've found the transitions to not be noticeable during gameplay. However, if we go to the PS5's HDR calibration screens while dynamic tone mapping is active, we can see the sun icon slowly fade in as the screen adjusts. So you'll want to switch over to the HGIG setting on your OLED in order to get accurate HDR calibration on PS5, Xbox consoles, or any other HDR capable devices. HGIG may look less impressive at a glance, but you should also consider using this mode rather than dynamic tone mapping when playing well-designed HDR content to get the intended effect, because it lets the source tell the TV exactly how the highlights and tone mapping should be, whereas dynamic tone mapping can be used to make up for deficiencies in the implementation, but some detail may be lost or clipped in the process. Now, let's suppose that we do want to play all of those modern Xbox and PlayStation games that lack HDR support with a more accurate SDR presentation. I mean, between current gen consoles, including the Switch, and retro games, I would wager 50% or more of the content I use on my living room TV is still SDR. So SDR performance remains very important, and this is where I was surprised to find that the C2 seems to have some artificial restraints that give it less potential for SDR content compared to the half-decade older C7. Note that we're not doing anything too fancy with color calibration, getting readings on scopes, or anything like that. I'm actually not the biggest stickler for attaining some industry standard of color reproduction, and am happy as long as details intended to be visible aren't lost, I have dark black levels, and a good white balance. I actually tend to prefer a cooler white balance because to my eyes, that's what feels closest to true white. So I've set both TVs to cool 30. Just for the sake of comparison, let's set the OLED light, the primary setting that you adjust for brightness, all the way up to 100 for both TVs. But what's going on here? Keep in mind that the camera exposure is only giving us an idea of the relative brightness difference, and the C2 doesn't necessarily feel this dim in person. Regardless, HDR content, especially the dynamic tone mapping feature, has proven that the C2 could easily beat the C7 in theory, but SDR cannot go nearly as bright. Mind you, that is not how bright I've kept my C7 over the years. For HDR sources, yes, the OLED light is set to 100, but for SDR sources, I very quickly realized it was much too bright. So I brought it down to 75 and have been very happy with that for years. Here's how I like to think about it. Since SDR content cannot show a brightness difference between an illuminated paper white and an actual light source, I think the OLED light should be set for a level that feels comfortable for paper white, because if you go higher than that, then the entire picture is way too eye-searingly bright, to me anyway. With that in mind, would you believe that my preferred SDR OLED light setting of 75 right now on the C7 is compared against OLED light 100 on the C2? I mean, I guess it's comparable enough, even if the settings are 25 steps apart. They're probably trying to further reduce the risk of burn-in or rein in the need to engage in auto brightness limiter that you'll sometimes see dim a super bright screen, especially on the C7. But short of maybe some service menu shenanigans, this is as bright as SDR content gets. In fact, to even increase the brightness at all, you have to dig around in the general settings and turn off the automatic energy saving functions. And even then at 100, well, once again, here's both TVs at their own 100, which is clearly quite a different scale. The peak brightness setting is only available in HDR mode, so we're stuck with this reduced SDR brightness cap. In one sense, I get it. SDR should not be as bright as HDR, so don't let the user screw it up too badly. But with OLED being considered too dim by many people for some applications, personally I disagree, why do they not just let the user go brighter for SDR content if they desired, when we know darn good and well the potential peak nits for HDR are way higher on the C2 than the C7? It's just a really strange move to me, because if a C7 user was also seeking to upgrade to a newer OLED, they might see this as a downgrade if they were the type of person who was keeping their brightness higher than I had. In addition, with equivalent values for color, contrast, and everything else, the SDR image on the C2 feels just a tad less punchy than what I can get with my long-standing C7 settings. And I just can't seem to push any closer to matching that on the C2 before starting to lose too much detail due to oversaturating the colors. Hey! Did you remember to turn off the AI brightness? What was that? Oh, the AI brightness. Yeah, of course I turned that off. Although now that you've sown the seeds of doubt in my head, I did later realize that AI brightness is prone to defaulting back on for new signal types, even on the same input, and since it's hidden in the general settings, I don't know for sure if I caught it for every resolution on all of the inputs. I'd redo them just to be doubly sure if I could, but for reasons that will become apparent in about 19 minutes, well, I kinda can't. You'll see. But AI brightness or not, I'm still extremely sure that the C2 cannot go as bright as a C7 for SDR content, even if you want it to. But I can't help but wonder if it's not just the guardrails put into the scalability of the screen's brightness, or if the newer Evo panel design could be partly to blame. I mean, heck, I'd consider my C7 to have as good of off-angle color as you could ever reasonably demand or need, while the whites in the C2 have a considerable pink shift off-angle. Not that you'd likely notice it in any seating position in my own living room, but I don't know, it just seems like LG is promoting Evo as the next big thing, the big feature on the box, but I'm not sure if any of its benefits and power efficiency actually improve the picture quality in any way that matters for myself, and in some ways it may be a step back. Oh, and there is one pixel that won't light up green. I wonder if that's going to be a widespread problem with this new Evo stuff, or if I just got unlucky. Not that you can see it from couch distance, but I mean, it is there. Now, since SDR content often runs at a resolution below the panel's native 2160p, this might be a good moment to bring up one of the dumbest long-standing quirks of modern digital TV design. Perhaps you've heard this before. Have you ever heard anyone say that input lag, color, or scaling quality might improve if you name your HDMI input PC? Sounds like an urban myth, but sadly, it is not. Here's the thing though, this is not a thing that you should always do, because labeling your input as PC can also have poorly documented, unforeseen consequences that will leave you dumbfounded as to what's causing the issue. For example, on my old C7, setting an input as PC causes considerable color banding on HDR content. So in this case, you really should be using the game console setting instead. Here on the C2, after pressing the input button, you can go to the home dashboard powered by ThinQ AI, barf, and pressing the 3 dots. After selecting the PC icon though, you can rename it whatever you want. And while input lag on the C2 does not change with any of the available input labels, PC does appear to process color at full 444 bandwidth, meaning no messy subsampling artifacts alongside color edges. Pay particular attention to the red areas here as we switch back and forth between game console and PC modes with this 720p image here. PC mode handles all colors at full resolution, resulting in much cleaner color edges, whereas blue and especially red are noticeably processed at a lower resolution in game console mode on both TVs. But the C2 on the right does have a quality advantage in this regard if you're using game console mode. Overall sharpness and edge clarity between the two is pretty similar for 720p scaling when in PC mode though. It's not 3x nearest neighbor as we might hope, but apparently TV manufacturers can't be bothered. The main reason I even wanted to bring up this whole input label nonsense is because the benefits of this are far more apparent on sub-native content like 720p or 1080p. Now, when it comes to 1080p content, PC mode is hardly as essential or obvious of an upgrade compared to 720p, but the differences are there if you look closely. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is a native 1080p game, but if you were so moved, it might be interesting to experiment with setting the Switch to 720p and trying PC mode for lower resolution games to see if the TV handles the full upscale better than the Switch. Luckily, I don't notice any color banding issues when it comes to HDR content in PC mode on the C2, unlike the C7. However, you still may find yourself locked out of certain settings. You can't change the peak brightness setting for HDR while in PC mode on the C2, for instance. So again, I must emphasize, PC mode on any given TV is not one size fits all for all types of content. I would suggest the game console label for modern 2160p consoles with HDR output, but PC mode may offer benefits elsewhere. One reason it's kind of a shame that you can't push brightness even higher for SDR content is if you enjoy using black frame insertion, commonly referred to as BFI. This is a new to me feature since it was introduced after the C7, but from what I hear, BFI performance peaked with the 2020 models, and its flexibility on the C2 is radically reduced compared to the 2021 models due to only having an on-off toggle and not being possible to use with 120Hz content. It's the first setting under the game optimizer called OLED motion within the true motion category, which sounds suspiciously like motion interpolation, but I assure you it is not. You can't choose anything like that when you're in the game optimizer. The purpose of black frame insertion is to get closer to CRT-like motion clarity by blanking the screen with a black frame for a certain duration between every frame from the source. This is similar to how a CRT's electron gun lights up the phosphors for the next frame as the previous frame fades. Unfortunately, it's simply impossible to accurately convey through a YouTube video the quality of a digital display's motion clarity, since a camera will capture every frame relatively sharply even if you do see blurring with your own eyes when viewing the screen in person. Unlike the 2020 and 2021 models, there is only one setting on C2, which I think is similar to high on the C1. Black frame insertion is not for everyone, and there are two main trade-offs you must accept when using it. The less apparent trade-off is input lag. It adds about 16 milliseconds here, the equivalent of 1 frame for a game running at 60 frames per second. The more obvious trade-off is that the picture will be dimmer, along with a sometimes visible flicker, especially in white or near white parts of the image. The picture will be even dimmer if you're using, say, scanline or shadow mask effects with retro gaming devices, which already darken the image quite a bit, but luckily classic games tend to be quite colorful and easy to see, so I think I could be willing to accept the trade-offs here in many situations. I find that my eyes adapt to the slight flicker rather quickly, and even after sitting down to play with it for about 4 hours, I didn't find it to be straining on my eyes, but some people will be more annoyed by it than others. I think you should give it a chance rather than just, immediately deciding you don't like it. And it does work. Motion clarity is considerably sharpened up, and it's especially noticeable in retro games or other side-scrolling games, but it is not perfect motion as seen on a CRT. Only the 2020 and 2021 models can approach that, with the 2020 models taking the crown, or so I hear. Also know that you cannot use black frame insertion if you have variable refresh rate set on your gaming device. And hey, that's okay, because VRR is probably the modern gaming feature I was most excited to experience with an HDMI 2.1 TV, although admittedly I have very few games on Xbox that seem to benefit from it. Lightning Returns is pretty choppy normally though due to the 4K boost and FPS boost on Series X, so this helps a ton. You can actually even see VRR frame rate info via the game optimizer or additional info by pressing the green remote button a bunch of times. It's pretty funny seeing the wild swings in Flight Simulator with 120Hz VRR, but even though the big hitches are very noticeable, it's neat to see those moments of relative smoothness since it is normally locked to 30 FPS. I've heard that there can be some sort of flicker, especially in dark colors when using VRR on OLED, but this is something I've not personally observed on the C2 yet. Either way, I'm very happy with VRR on the Xbox so far and can't wait for it to be implemented on the PS5. So far, things are okay, I guess. I mean, if it's your first OLED and you're focused exclusively on modern gaming, the C2 will probably blow you away. But for me, better HDR, that's great. HDMI 2.1, that's nice to have. But unless you have a problem with your current OLED like me and the C7, it's not a necessary upgrade in my view. But if you'd asked me what was the one feature I was genuinely excited about gaining with a new OLED, it would have been increased compatibility with oddball high-resolution signals that are often available on modern hardware for retro gaming. You'll never see that as a marketing bullet point, and it'll never be given any serious weight by hardly anyone reviewing these TVs. And the fact that the CX and the C1 from 2020 and 2021 work so well with such devices is probably more of a happy accident than an intended feature. And the C2 seems to suggest that these formats stand on precarious ground with LG, because there are worrying compatibility problems, at least at launch, particularly in regard to input lag. Let's talk about the good news first. Input lag under normal circumstances is really low on the LG C2 and is basically the same as the LG C1. My Time Sleuth can test 240p, 480i, 480p, 720p, and 1080p all at 60Hz, but since the C2 doesn't have analog inputs, we're not going to bother with 240p or 480i. When in Game Optimizer mode, there are 3 main scenarios we want to test the lag for across various resolutions. Prevent input delay set to standard, prevent input delay set to boost, and then also with black frame insertion, which is only available when set to standard instead of boost. 480p, 720p, and 1080p all perform identically in standard mode, around 9 milliseconds. I think I already said this, but just so everyone is on the same page, 1 frame in a 60 frames per second game lasts about 16 milliseconds. So as far as most people would be concerned, 9 milliseconds is zero lag. But boost mode is intended to further reduce this, and it does. 1080p goes down to 2 milliseconds. However, 480p and 720p both have boost mode glitches that are inherited from the C1, which are that, for whatever reason, 480p actually has more lag in boost mode than standard mode, up to 19 milliseconds. And that while 720p has only 2 milliseconds, boost mode gives it a persistent screen tear, making it totally worthless at that resolution. So definitely use standard mode for any 480p or 720p sources. Lastly, black frame insertion, as I said, adds about a frame of lag on its own, resulting in 26 milliseconds across the board. That includes the 9-ish milliseconds of delay that standard mode already has. This is slightly over a frame and a half of lag in total, which is not something most people probably need to worry about. So if black frame insertion appeals to you, I'd say go for it. I don't have the means to get data for 2160p input delay, but I think it's reasonable to assume that it's the same or similar enough to 1080p across these scenarios. So, in short, aside from the boost mode quirks, the C2 gives very consistent and extremely playable input lag readings regardless of what resolution it's receiving. So what's my problem? Well, my problem is that there's a problem new to the C2. Displaying 16:9 always results in the lowest lag, while switching to a 4:3 aspect ratio costs 16 milliseconds all on its own. Consider the 480p lag readings that we got previously. In standard mode, that 9 milliseconds is only as low as it is because the test was performed at 16:9. And there is a lot of 4.3 480p content that a nerd like me might use, whether that's from a Carby HDMI adapter for GameCube or a Make Megahertz Xbox HDMI mod. Trust me, I tested this from every reasonable angle. Triple checked Game Optimizer was still on, forced 4.3 on the TV, allowed the TV to switch to 4.3 by itself by choosing original aspect ratio, changed the device's output flags between 16:9 and 4.3, checked if just scan would work even though it's grayed out in Game Optimizer mode, and I even set the input label as PC, game console, and every other stupid icon offered. 4.3 adds a substantial amount of lag no matter how you do it, no matter whether the original source is 4.3 or not. If you want to see more about my testing methodology and see the lag spikes as I show and explain the situation in a more off-the-cuff manner, I upload a no-frills unlisted video to share around when I was looking for help to find out if people could reproduce these issues on CX or C1 units, and I've linked that video in the description below. The real tragedy to me, though, is how this 4.3 lag increase ruins 1920 by 1440, which is a 4.3 variant of 1440p. This has been such a wonderful and clever means of squeezing extra vertical resolution out of hardware with more modest HDMI chips, like the Mr. FPGA system and RetroTink 5X upscaler for original hardware. And boy, does it look fantastic on the C2. I mean, 1080p looks great too, it's plenty sharp, but CRT effects can especially benefit from more resolution. You gotta understand here that hardware capable of driving 2160p over HDMI is simply out of reach for retro hardware engineers right now, and likely will be for the foreseeable future. So 1920 by 1440 is a great way to help these games take further advantage of a 4K screen when it's accepted by the display. It works on the CX, C1, and C2, along with the standard 2560 by 1440 widescreen version of 1440p. But for no good reason, 1920 by 1440 gets an additional lag penalty just because it's 4.3. Now, the RetroTink 5X does have a widescreen 2560 by 1440 mode that's considered an experimental, unsupported resolution, which, just like the 1080p output modes, includes its own pillar boxes as part of the full widescreen signal and preserves the aspect ratio without needing to have the TV do it. But I've found this mode to be unstable with Super Nintendo, at least on this TV, so it's not a perfect solution to the problem for all consoles. For users of the open source scan converter, the OSSC, one of the prime resolutions from that device is 1280 by 960, a 4x scale of 240p, and, well, big surprise, 4.3 lag strikes again. And And anyone who uses one of the more budget-friendly RetroTink devices, the 2X series, is also penalized because those output 480p with a 4:3 aspect ratio. These are all great devices, they're working as they should, and they are not at fault here. It's just that the LG C2's firmware is simply unfair to 4:3 in a way that LG OLEDs have never been previously. The worst case scenario here is 4:3 content with black frame insertion, which takes us over 40 milliseconds. And just in case you think that the black frame insertion must be messing with the time sleuth's numbers or something like that, let's also check with the 240p Test Suite's lag test via the Mister in 1920 by 1440. While this does not give us a measurement down to the milliseconds, you can see that the camera's shutter is capturing the C2's frame counter as being 3 frames behind the CRT, which, yeah, 42 milliseconds is getting very close to 3 frames. A lot of people would consider 3 frames to be unplayable, and a lot of others would swear up and down that there is no lag at all. But the problem is, it all adds up. Think of your own personal latency tolerance like a budget. Anything below that threshold doesn't hurt at all, but once you start to go over budget, you start to feel it. Let's suppose you're looking at a few delicious gaming delicacies to spend your disposable latency budget on for playing a game through the Mister. Ooh, a wireless Bluetooth controller would be really nice, and black frame insertion would make the screen scrolling look so crisp and clean. Oh, and I'd love to play in 1920 by 1440 rather than 1080p so that the picture would be that much sharper. Huh? What? Oh, you're playing an old game? Says the C2. Sure, okay, but not stretching it costs 16 milliseconds? Well, 4:3 used to be free back in my day, but whatever, fine. I want my 1440p. Oof, that might have been a mistake though. If we'd stuck with 1080p output from the Mister, we wouldn't have had to pay extra for 4:3. So adding black frame insertion on top of that would have only taken us up to about 26 milliseconds. Hey, that's pretty tolerable, and we might have even still been able to use that wireless controller without going noticeably over budget. But our only options for taking 1440p without going bankrupt is to either play in boost mode at 4:3, which is about 18 milliseconds, so we might get away with a wireless controller. Or we play with black frame insertion, feel deep regret at having just spent 42 milliseconds, and go hunt for a long enough USB cable so that we can play wired. And still probably be able to rightly blame at least some of our missed jumps and deaths on the total accumulated lag. Well, you know what, you darn fresh-faced OLED? You're charging me more to give me less, and I don't gotta put up with your guff no more. Hey, what happened to 1200p? You kept it on the menu only to serve me up this garbage? Yeah, no one really cares about that except nerds with HDMI mods for N64. Well, you know who did care about that? And who did display games at 4:3 with zero cost to lag? Every single OLED that I ever met that ran this dump before. Maybe old man C7 couldn't do 1440p, but he had the best 1200p up until, the streaks. And he was an OLED of principle. Consistent prices, didn't matter who you were or what you wanted. That's just 17 milliseconds plus tax, sir. And don't think I didn't catch you getting yourself twice into some glitchy mode that totally screwed up your frame delivery. Oh, I know you thought I didn't see, but that flash every 8 seconds when you kept skipping a black frame insertion made it very clear to me what was going on. Look, you were pretty out of it, and I know you don't know this, but I tried to help. I really did. I tried everything I could think of. But the only thing that could fix you was a factory reset. Look, I know you're new here. A few firmware updates and you might just learn to do this job right. But first impressions matter, and I don't have time to wait and see. Especially not when I know that your older sibling, C1, is still available, can still do everything I want done, can do it faster, and will give me more options for black frame insertion. I'm sorry, kid, but you didn't make the cut. I don't know what came over me there, but that's pretty much how it went down, with a few dramatic flourishes. But thanks to folks with the necessary tools who follow the MLeague Twitter, we were able to confirm that the gulf and lag between 16.9 and 4.3 is a unique issue to the C2 that does not exist on the CX or C1. MLeague viewer Fevian in particular was able to get me extremely comprehensive and convincing data on 1920 by 1440 performance in normal, boost, and black frame insertion modes. And before then, Corey was already saying, you know you're going to return that TV no matter whether the issues are going to get fixed or not, because it's tainted for you at this point. And he was exactly right. That nailed it. That is exactly how I felt. But Fevian's lag readings were the last push I needed to convince myself to go straight to Best Buy and set up an exchange for a C1 before my return window for the C2 would end on April 21st. Well, as they don't say, another day, another OLED. And what an OLED! To everyone who kept shaking their heads at me when I was saying, I'm just sticking with 55 inches, I'm sorry, you were right. I mean, you never really get a sense for how big a TV is until you see it in your own space, and this thing has some serious presence. Normally, the price gap between 55 and 65 makes it pretty hard to justify, but I mean, at this point, the previous year's models are so steeply discounted that I only had to pay an extra $100 for a 65-inch C1 when setting up the exchange at Best Buy. So, since I already had money in the game, why the heck not? I deserved a treat after the C2 fiasco, and now at least I feel like I've got an upgrade over my C7 and not just a replacement. So the rest of this video is going to be a lot more casual, much less B-roll heavy, maybe even a little rambly, but I just kind of want to decompress, reflect on the situation, and check for your information as well as my own, whether the C1 really does sidestep the deal-breaking issues as well as some of the smaller quirks that I experienced with the C2. I mean, I just can't do a full-on review of a year-old TV, but any of you who didn't already completely check out over my super niche complaints, I mean, maybe a C1 is the right thing for you too, and maybe you want to get one while you still can, and while they're still so cheap. Relatively cheap. Very, very relatively. Well, let's start with what kind of panel is in this C1. All of the 2022 C series, except for I think the very smallest size, are using the Evo panels, which were actually new last year in the higher end G series. But later on in 2021, Evo panels were starting to appear not only in G1 units, but also in C1 units. So based on what the internet says, if the fourth letter after the period on the TV's model number, which is also visible on the box, is a P or a W, well, you've got a C1 with an Evo panel. I was actually pretty surprised at how recent the manufacturing date is too. I figured they'd just be full steam ahead on just making 2022 units by November last year. And you can also grab a service menu remote on Amazon for like $7, which I did just to double confirm, and yes, there it is, I have an Evo panel. Which is strange because, well, the off-angle color does not shift pink like on the C2. Here's that C2 shot from before again. It probably doesn't come off super clearly in the video, but because of this and other quirks, I wasn't so sure I wanted an Evo panel in my replacement C1. But the off-angle color here on my 65-inch C1, Evo or not, is perfect, or perfect enough, easily better than what I observed on the 55-inch C2. So I guess that's good. People seem to believe that Evo may come with increased longevity compared to earlier panel types due to greater power efficiency. Now, whether this is specifically thanks to Evo or not, I also noticed that leaving the Switch dark mode dashboard up for a few minutes, always a reliable source of temporary image retention, made significantly fainter after images on the flat middle gray background compared to my C7, and I'd say my observations on the C2 were similar to the C1 in this regard. Remember, this is temporary retention that is common and normal and fades quickly, not burn it. The C7's protective darkening that occurs on mostly static screens also becomes much stronger, much faster compared to the C1. And again, I'm pretty sure the C2 was similar to this C1 behavior when I still had it around. That's just something I had to get used to with the C7. And really, it's not obtrusive during active use, except during like reading lore logs in a game or a character creator where the image content is not changing enough and it thinks it needs to dim down the screen a bunch. And you can disable that kind of stuff with a service remote, but it's risky. And so far, it seems like on the C1, it's not going to kick in as strongly or as quickly as I've already been used to over the years. But during regular play, when these preventative measures are not in effect, you might recall that I was still rather bummed out by the lackluster SDR performance on the C2. HDR on the newer models is definitely brighter than HDR on the C7. A bit brighter or much brighter depending on settings. But SDR is darker, sometimes much darker. So what's the verdict on the C1? Well, after I remembered to go dig around for the AI settings so I could disable AI brightness and get rid of logo dimming, not really necessary for games in my opinion, well, now this is a picture I can get behind. But just like the C2, the C1 is maxed out for SDR content here. This is OLED Light 100, while the C7 is only at OLED Light 75. Which means it could still go much brighter than the newer models if you wanted it to. Let's bring up this Monster Boy comparison again with the C7 versus the C2. The darker picture combined with the less saturated colors really makes the C2 feel like a much less exciting image overall. Meanwhile, on the C1, rather than feeling dull, the less saturated colors actually come across as very pleasing and honestly more natural than what's on the C7, since it's coming much closer to matching it in SDR brightness. So whereas the C2 felt comparatively lifeless due to its dimmer SDR image, the C1 makes me feel like maybe the C7 was a touch oversaturated all along and I just never really thought about it. So ultimately, even though the SDR OLED light at 100 on the C1 just gets up to what I want to see, I am very happy and satisfied with how the SDR is looking compared to how I felt with SDR on the C2, so that is a big relief. But I should point out that I have heard that larger OLEDs might be able to go brighter than the smaller ones. I haven't looked into it enough to verify myself, but maybe a 55-inch C1 would have left me equally dissatisfied with SDR content, I don't know. But the fact remains, with either year's models, if you've enjoyed having the OLED light on at 80 or 90 or 100 for SDR content on an older OLED, then you might need to brace yourself for a bit of a downgrade regardless of whether you go for C1 or C2. I wish I knew what year this SDR limiter was put into place, and like I said before, SDR should absolutely not go as bright as HDR, and they're probably trying to protect the screens to some extent, but it's still sure to disappoint some people. I imagine QD OLED must be able to go much brighter for SDR content, so if you really do need brighter and you have the cash, well, I hope someone does a good gaming review for those because it sure ain't gonna be me. So moving on from that, I actually realized I talked hardly at all about 120 Hz stuff on the C2, and there's kind of a couple of reasons I didn't have much to say. Partly because I really wanted to use black frame insertion on it, and also that I don't have access to terribly many 120 Hz capable games, especially considering a recent PS5 update forces an HDMI 2.1 feature called Auto Low Latency Mode, or ALLM, which makes it impossible to turn on black frame insertion on PS5 content unless you can disable ALLM on your TV, which the CX can do, but the C1 and the C2 cannot for some reason. So surely Sony will make this an option soon. I mean, they kind of have to, honestly. It's a toggle on Xbox, and for good reason, because auto low latency mode sounds like a good thing, but I don't think it actually reduces lag in any way you couldn't set up your TV to do manually, and it blocks you out of some features that might add lag, but maybe you just want to use anyway. But at any rate, the other reason I didn't say much about 120 Hz on the C2 is because, well, without the ability to use black frame insertion on 120 Hz content, to me it's kind of like, what's the point? Like, this probably pegs me as such a peasant to all of the hardcore PC gamers out there, but to me, 120 FPS is just nothing like the jump from 30 to 60, and I don't really care all that much about it on its own. But black frame insertion makes a 120 Hz game a significantly more intriguing proposition for me. And this is where we can see that the C1 can not only actually pull it off at 120 Hz, but also that there are several more options in general: low, medium, and high. And after testing with the popular Blurbuster's UFO test on my computer, I really saw the benefit of the C1 offering more options than the C2, because different BFI settings seem to benefit different frame rates, and automatic doesn't seem to necessarily do what I think is best in each scenario. So just to use 120 Hz as an example here, while the high setting does provide the clearest motion clarity, medium is actually not that much less clear, but it is a good bit less dim, and there is absolutely zero perceptible flicker, even on pure white. Both high and medium provide substantially higher motion clarity compared to not using black frame insertion at all, so I think I'll go with medium for 120 Hz content myself. I mean, I honestly feel like 120 Hz feels like an incomplete next-gen feature without BFI, so I definitely felt like I was going to be missing out if I just stuck with my C2. Be warned though, the medium and low BFI settings look absolutely terrible for 60 Hz content. I can't really show it, but it results in something of a double image in motion. So in this case, it's high or nothing. So it really depends on what kind of game you're playing, how bright it is, whether the flicker might be too perceptible or whatever. Personally, I think I'll use it a lot for side-scrolling games and retro games, but otherwise, I'm not sure yet. And by the way, the high setting looks and performs very similarly to the single on-off toggle on the C2 based on my experience. Apparently the CX can actually achieve perfect motion clarity for 120 Hz and 60 Hz content, but for some reason the C1 is a step back in performance. Maybe the modes don't get as dark on the C1, I don't know. Oh, and by the way, pro tip, you should never try to use black frame insertion on a game that targets 30 frames per second, because normal game consoles are always going to be outputting at least 60 Hz, and the result is a really awful double image in motion, so you just have to live with the blur like you always have. Actually, that's kind of similar to how black frame insertion will give a double image effect on 60 frames per second games if you're using 120 Hz output from an Xbox. So like it or not, you kind of do need to micromanage black frame insertion, 60 Hz and 120 Hz and variable refresh modes kind of on a game by game basis. It's unfortunate, but just how it is. Now, as for the low BFI setting, I thought maybe it would somehow work for native 30 Hz output from another type of device, or movies outputting natively at 24 Hz, but the fact of the matter is that the UFO test shows up to quadruple images for those frame rates on any BFI setting, so there doesn't really seem to be a use case for the low setting at all, in my opinion, as far as I can figure out. So, up to this point, I seem to have a net win with the C1 here, but we finally got to talk about compatibility and input lag. Even with the information I gathered from our viewers, I was still a little nervous about what I'd see when I did the test myself. But first, since aspect ratio settings turned out to be the Achilles heel of lag on the C2, let's take a quick look and see what's different about the C1's aspect ratio selection. Because, well, hello there, four-way zoom. While I found references to this feature in the C2 manual, it was simply not in my aspect ratio menu when I had the C2. Was it not implemented yet? Was it removed? Or maybe does it appear if you're using a picture mode other than Game Optimizer? I don't know. Either way, while I didn't exactly use this feature frequently on my C7, it was helpful for, say, scaling up PSP games or other games that may appear in a smaller frame. So why was it removed? I don't know, because here on the C1, it doesn't add any lag. That's right, none of the aspect ratio settings, including, crucially, 4:3, add any additional milliseconds to the time sleuth readings. So even more good news is that the extremely normal resolutions that I can test, 480p, 720p, 1080p, they are all very comparable in performance to the C2, and the C1 might actually offer some slight advantages. Standard mode for all of these resolutions actually tends to be about half a millisecond faster on the C1. I mean, that's not really much of anything, but it now is just a bit under 9 milliseconds. Boost mode lag is also pretty much exactly the same. 1080p is right at just about 2 milliseconds, and as with the C2, 480p weirdly goes up to around 18 milliseconds. However, in a twist, 720p boost mode is actually usable on the C1. Remember how I said that the C2 has this bizarre screen tear-like artifact at the top of the screen with 720p boost mode content, and how I said that that bug is inherited from the C1? Well, that was true, but the reality is that the bug can be avoided on the C1 by choosing any input label other than PC. When I was going into testing the C2, I was already aware of this issue on the C1 from Ace in the MLIG Discord, and he clearly said that the tear only happens when the label is PC. So because of that, I did specifically test other input labels for 720p boost mode on the C2 and found that the issue did not apply only to PC mode. It was everywhere. But Ace was right about the C1. The 720p boost mode tear only appears if the input is labeled PC. So another win for the C1, even if it is only because the older model has a less severe version of a glitch that shouldn't exist in the first place. And once again, black frame insertion lag for 480p, 720p, and 1080p lines up with my expectations based on my experience with the C2. High BFI is about 25 or 26 milliseconds in total, and while low and medium read is only about 17 milliseconds, remember that they look poor for 60 Hz content, which is what I'm testing for. Now, when it comes to the oddball retro hardware upscaling resolutions, I should probably clarify how I test resolutions that are not on the time sleuth. So basically I have a Porta HDMI to component transcoder, which is lag-free or lag-free enough. And so I set the time sleuth to 240p or 480p and run it via HDMI into the Porta. And from there, out component into the component inputs on the RetroTink 5X. We know that this chain adds roughly 3 milliseconds of lag because when testing one of the standard 1080p output modes from the Tink, we get about 3 milliseconds more on the C1 compared to if we had just had a direct HDMI connection from the time sleuth when testing 1080p. So remember to subtract 3 from what you're seeing on the screen here. We find that the non-standard resolutions like 1200p, 1440p, and 1536p give us about 17 milliseconds in standard mode, 2 milliseconds in boost mode, and 34 milliseconds when using black frame insertion. So the short version is that weirdo resolutions on the C1 perform the same as 1080p in boost mode, which is good, that's very good. But in standard mode, they have an additional 8 milliseconds of delay compared to 1080p and the other normal resolutions, which of course also impacts black frame insertion. Of course, that is a fair bit better than getting a full 16 milliseconds add just for saying a 4:3 aspect ratio on the C2, but the C1 may not be winning by the full mile that you and I might have been hoping for. I mean, 34-ish milliseconds is definitely better than 42-ish milliseconds, but at around 2 frames of lag, black frame insertion, for the oddball resolutions at least, is standing on fairly precarious ground. Of course, if you were willing to take the cut in clarity, you could always set your RetroTink or Mister to output 1080p instead, which would take you down to about 26 milliseconds with BFI. Regardless, the C1 lag improvements range from half a frame better to a full frame better. And like I said, that does increase the acceptability of using wireless controllers and such, just that much more. So even clawing back just a half a frame can definitely make a difference when considering the total accumulated lag, even if half a frame on its own would be no big deal at all. But now, there is one resolution where the C2 wins, and that's for the full widescreen 2560 by 1440 version of 1440p, which is handled just as quickly as 1080p. However, just like on the C2, I found Super Nintendo to be unstable on the C1 via the RetroTink 5X with this particular experimental mode. However, less finicky systems seem to be fine with this mode on the C1 and C2. And that is the only RetroTink resolution, and experimental resolution mind you, that I found to have stability issues on C1 or C2. Now, earlier I showed an F0X clip that shows that 1200p tends to be super broken on the C2, and 1536p actually behaves the exact same way. However, both resolutions work just fine on the C1. It's just that they have basically the same lag readings as 1440p, which means an extra 8 milliseconds in standard mode. But they're super fast in boost mode, so keep that in mind. Now, the last thing that we should probably do is actually make sure that 1440p via the Mister still has a clarity advantage over 1080p on the C1 as it did on the C2. And see if 1536p, which was designed for interfacing with repurposed iPad screens by the way, could even offer a further advantage itself. Well, keep in mind that I am using sharp interpolation here, as I believe you almost always should. But even so, I think it's easy enough to see that 1440p has a clarity advantage over 1080p. It's subtle, yeah, but it is an advantage nonetheless, and is of course going to be more noticeable on a bigger 65-inch screen than a 55-inch one. And in addition to the clarity, I feel like the Mister's interpolation is more effective on the 1440p image with more consistent pixel sizing. Meanwhile, 1536p works just fine, but any additional jump in clarity over 1440p is a bit tough for me to make out here. I also think that 1440p seems to work best with some of the shadow mask effects with the cleanest representation of the texture, so I just wanted to showcase that on the right there. Ultimately, you can't go wrong with any of these resolutions, and sure, 1080p is just fine and offers its own advantages, like an input lag. But I do like the idea of taking just that much more extra advantage of a 4K screen's potential clarity with my retro games. Oh, and one last thing, I just gotta squeeze this in because I know people have probably already commented that, you probably shouldn't play those 4.3 games on OLED. Well, I know lots of people who do, and the streaks on my C7 are evenly distributed between the middle and sides, so I think it's pretty convincing evidence that retro gaming did not ruin my C7. Well, I think that's more than enough for me on the LG C2 and C1 OLEDs. If anyone watching this is a regular TV reviewer and thinks I'm swerving into their lane, don't worry, I hated this. I don't want to do a video like this ever again. I don't want to buy a brand new TV in the launch period ever again. But to me, the measure of a TV isn't just how beautifully it handles the latest Dolby Vision movies or the latest games. It's not just the peak nits or the color accuracy, it's the compatibility, the sub-native scaling quality, and the input lag across a wider range of signals that wouldn't normally be tested for. So seriously, if you regularly review TVs and you'd like to win some cred in the classic gaming scene, please reach out to us at My Life in Gaming or Retro RGB or the guys at Digital Foundry, because we'd absolutely be interested in helping you further understand what kinds of devices and signals we would like to see tested on TVs and how you might be able to integrate that into your process. But at any rate, I hope that this has helped at least a couple of people who were maybe interested in getting an LG C1 or C2, and I don't know, maybe it's just been an interesting look at the trials and tribulations of being a gamer who loves all eras of gaming and reconciling new and old technology. So what do you think? Will the C1 be LG's last great OLED? You think the C2 will eventually manage to match it over time? Or will the inevitable C3 drift even further away from niche gaming interests? When the hopefully far off time does come that my C1 will no longer be my primary living room TV, will LG still be the gamer's pick for the best video file screen? Will it be Sony or Samsung or no one at all? Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But Whatever the case, thanks for watching, and I wish you and your OLED a long and healthy life.